10:03. I'm Carol Weinshell, Vice President of Programming and Membership at Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport. I only say that at the beginning of every program, so we have it for archival purposes, even though you all know who I am anyway. And what we're going to do this morning, I can't do what Nima thinks I can do. What we're going to do this morning is we have wonderful guests, Rabbi David Nelson and his wife Alicia, and you know them very well. And they're going to talk about their time in Rio. There's very little I can tell you because they are phenomenal. So I'm going to give the stage to them. You are all muted. When they're ready for a break or the opportunity to for you to ask questions, I'll ask you if you'll just raise your hand because it'll show up on my screen, and we'll go from there. And we will wrap up just shy of 11 o'clock.
Good. Okay. I want to make one correction. Only one half of us is phenomenal, and that's Alicia.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
You need to be able to go home.
Right, okay. It's not to go on the record. And you'll see that demonstrated today.
Okay, thank you. All right. So I'm going to do the introduction, and then David is going to talk first. So the Nelson love affair with Brazil started in June of 1967. David had accepted the position to be the assistant rabbi at the congregation that was known as Asociação Religiosa Israelita, which is ARI by its initials. That's how it's known in the community, as the ARI. And so we were on our way to Brazil for a 2-year commitment where David was going to be the rabbi. Now, we love to talk about Brazil because I said that we arrived there in 1967, but we've been back about 8 or 9 times. And we will tell you more about the people there who had a great influence on us and the places. So what we've done is we've decided to divide our little talk into 4 parts. Jewish history in Brazil, Jewish places in Brazil that we love, Jewish people in Brazil who made a great impression on us, and then we're going to wind up with just some of the idiosyncratic Brazilian stories and attitudes and behaviors that we fell in love with. So David is going to start with Jewish history.
And it has bearing on the Jews of North America, as you will see, if I don't forget to make the point. And that is Brazilian Jewish history begins when the first Jewish man sets foot in the shores of Brazil, in the land discovered by Pedro Cabral. Cabral in 1500 finds his way to Brazil, and his map consultant and others on board were Jewish. Now, why were they anxious to leave that part of the world in 1500? Well, the expulsion of the Jews of Portugal happened 5 years after the Jews were expelled from Spain. So 1497, they are out. And so they start to come to Brazil, and Recife is known also as Pernambuco because there's a famous battle fought in Pernambuco in 1654. That is that's a key date. I want you to remember 1654 because that's the beginning of the first religious struggle for religious liberty in the New World, and it's in the Southern Hemisphere. They were all, so they came to Recife because the Inquisition. The Inquisition. The holy, trying to destroy the Jewish bodies in order to save our souls, and it should have been the other way around in Jewish history. They should have left our bodies alone and let us deal with our souls ourselves. But they wanted to do a religious thing, the Inquisition, and they had something called the auto de fe, the act of faith. For us, it was the burning at the stake. it wasn't so romantic as the sound. It sounds Rodeph, and they were to skip. Well, I'm going to get into that segment in a moment. Then, the bamboo. Okay, so in 1654 Brazilians. Well, no, let me go that the Inquisition from Lisbon was keeping a watchful eye on the Jews, but many were observing their Judaism in secret. They were called crypto-Jews. They don't like the term Moranos is an ugly term given to us by our people who don't like us. It means swine. So I will avoid using the word Moranos, even though Cecil Roth wrote a wonderful book, The History of the Moranos, the historian wrote that. But we call them crypto-Jews or secret Jews, anusim, forced to live their ancestral faith in secret. So in 1620, a war breaks out between Spain and Holland, and in the conquest of the colony by the Dutch. The Dutch win out, and so in 1654, 34 years later, they lose. The Battle of Recife or Pernambuco is won by the Portuguese. Any Jews who were secretly, they can openly profess who openly profess their Judaism up to 1654. When it gets transferred, when the battle ends up being won by the Portuguese, the Jews who openly lived as Jews, they have to leave the country, and they do. The others become the best Catholics in Brazil. When we were there, they would say the best Catholics in the Jew, it's a 90%, 95% then a Catholic country, but they blended in. And who left? 3 ships left from the port of Pernambuco and Recife, and 2 went back to Amsterdam. Because Amsterdam had a large Jewish community of 802 rabbis in 1654, but Recife had 1,400 Jewish families and no rabbis. So the 3 ships head back to Amsterdam, and one is pirated by a group of French pirates, and they rob them of everything they have except the clothes on their back. And then these 23 Jews end up in the port of New Amsterdam, and they come into contact with Peter Stuyvesant. Now we're talking about Jewish history in its formation, and New Amsterdam was the port of New York, and here is what Peter Stuyvesant said when the Jews, this 23 Jews who were bedraggled and didn't have anything, no possessions, it was all stolen from them on the high seas, and he says no. He's going to write to the Dutch West Indies, the company, which was not just a company, controlled the country, and he's recommending most seriously. This is a quote from historical books. Most seriously, that this deceitful race, that's us, right, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ be not allowed further to invest and trouble this new colony. And he writes this to the Dutch West Indies, which he doesn't know is controlled by Jews. And they say, those 23 Sephardic Jews are to be welcomed as long as they don't need public support, and the rest is American Jewish history. And they had left in Brazil, in Recife, the first congregation. Then people say it's in Curacao and other places which are very historic, but Tzur Yisrael, the Rock of Israel, was founded in 1640, and it needed a rabbi. And so there was a rabbinic search committee, and they had 2 candidates, 2 rabbis who were leading figures in the Amsterdam Jewish world. And one was Menashe ben Israel, who was very famous, and a philosopher, mystic, wrote many books. He's recorded as a real historical figure. and they selected the other one. And who is the other one? There's going to be a test at the end of this. I want you to remember the first rabbi in the New World came 1640, and he was Isaac Aboabdi Fonseca. And that's a mouthful. And he stays until he has to leave, when obviously in 1654. So that's the history. And then we jump I go back a little bit in 1618 that you realize to 1624, that period of 6 years, a list of 25 Brazilian Judaizers were being tried before the Holy Inquisition in Lisbon. It took them back to try them and to burn them at the stake. And I'll just read you a little bit so we don't think we get to understand their names. Ana de Costa, Britis de Costa, Manuel Espinosa Diaz, Diego Lopez. So, and some of the names, the 23 Jewish families form the community in New York. They form a congregation after a few years called Sheherit Yisrael, the remnant of Israel. And that's the story of how American Jewish history, North American Jewish history, is helped along by the Brazilian story.
Okay, all right. So that finishes that segment. Now, does anybody have any comments or questions?
So where did the 23 Jewish families start out from to get to New York? What was the name of the community? It was Recife. And if you want to pronounce Portuguese correctly, you don't really pronounce the R, as Alicia will tell you. She speaks. Tell them how you pronounce it.
No, it's Recife.
Recife, like it's an H.
Yeah, they do. They pronounce the R like an H. Okay, all right. Any questions or comments? Okay.
If you have a question, you can raise your hand and I will find you. Right now, you don't have the ability to unmute, but I will change that as we go along.
Okay.
Nima set me up this way, and so just so as not to have a distraction. So if there are no questions, then we'll go on.
All right. Well, so we have to do, before we go to the next part of our talk, we have to certainly take a minute because we're very big into staying healthy. And I'm assuming that, like the rest of you, we're confined to these four walls most of the day. So sit up in your chair, sit up tall, put your head up so it touches the ceiling, stretch up, 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 up. And then turn one way. Use your hands to help you. You can grab the back of the chair and twist one way. And come back to the center and twist the other way. And go back to the center. Good. All right. And you can take a deep breath and blow it out. And we'll talk about places in Brazil that we love. So we were there 2 years. We loved Brazil. We almost stayed in Rio, but because of family pressures, we decided to come back to the States. And we came back and we always said, oh, we love Brazil. There's so much history, Jewish history in Brazil. And a friend said, well, if you want to take Jews back to Brazil, let's do it. So we organized a trip to Brazil and we visited Manaus, which is the largest city as you go up the Amazon from the Atlantic. And so Manaus, it's not a beautiful city, but it's an interesting city because it's huge. It's huge, it's vast, it's industrial. Belém is the city on the coast, but Manaus becomes the main port of trucking things up the Amazon and then back out from the Amazon to the real world. And Manaus has a Jewish congregation, which is very, very interesting. It's a small community. They're a very organized together community, as many small communities. You know yourself, being a small community, that the smaller you are, the more involved with each other you become. So sometimes there's greater strength in small communities than you have in these large sprawling communities like Sao Paulo. So nevertheless, we met some people there. We were there for Purim with a group that we took on a tour, and they showed us a scroll that they have in their ark that is about 400 years old. They rarely take it out because it's so fragile. And they explained that it actually had been in a community further up the Amazon, but as that community started to dwindle, they felt that it was safer to bring it back to Manaus. So if you think back 400 years, you're talking to in the 1500s at the point when we were there and they made that statement, because we were there at the end of the it was about 1993 or 94. And so it was very, very interesting. We were there for Purim, and it was interesting to see how they celebrate. I mean, the celebration is much the same, but it was still kind of fun to be there with them.
We didn't have anybody who was able to read the Megillah in Hebrew, but they read it in Portuguese.
Yes.
They're very faithful to doing all of the rituals, but they have to accommodate to not having somebody who could chant it according to the way the Megillah is read.
Yes. Okay. Anyway, so Manaus is a very interesting community. We've been there several times. The last time we were there was with our children. We decided that it was about 50 years since we had lived in Brazil. We should take our children and grandchildren on a trip down memory lane. And so my daughter said, oh, as long as we're going to do a trip to Brazil, why don't we do something on the Amazon? So we accepted her challenge. The jumping off point was Manaus. And then we did this little family trip up the Amazon. We were traveling, about 2-3 hours by boat, by truck, by boat. We kept switching off. There was a lot of flooding because the Amazon, rises and falls 40 feet every season. So, but we went to this very, very primitive area, and that was a whole other adventure, which we're not going to talk about right now. But one of the other places that we have been fascinated with was Recife, which my husband just talked about. And Recife was this major Jewish community in the 1600s. But as time goes on, life builds up, and they had no physical record of where the synagogue had been. They knew it was in a general area, but they had never actually found any remains of the synagogue. There were no sisterhood books or scrapbooks from the year that the synagogue put together. That's a joke. But in any case, so then in the early 1990s, they were excavating the harbor because they wanted to develop a tourist area of some of the other historic things that went on in that area. And they stumbled upon a mikveh. And they realized immediately that it had to be part of the synagogue that existed in the 1640s when they brought Rabbi Isaac Boa ben Fonseca de Fonseca to the community. At that point in time, when the synagogue was flourishing, they told us that the Jewish community had been about 10% of the total population. Yes. And it was run under the Dutch, and the Dutch were very into open, tolerance, and so they were allowed to do it, to live their lives peacefully. It was only when the Portuguese came in that things changed. But Recife has you can go to Recife today and see there is a museum which they've set up. You can see the mikveh, and they've created all kinds of artifacts and explanations of the community. And they have a small meeting room, which is kind of like a chapel in the building, and that exists in Recife today.
Okay, and now I want to jump, if you allow me to jump to 1908, and a man by the name of Rabbi Solomon Moal, Moyal, is raising money for the yeshuv, the settlement in Israel, 1908. And not happily for him, he dies of a fever, and he's buried in the largest Catholic cemetery in Manaus. Did I say Recife? No.
Yeah, that's okay.
Manaus.
That's okay. We're
So
going to
he's
backtrack.
traveling to the city of Manaus. He's in the Amazon, the state of Amazonas, and he dies. They bury him. There's no Jewish place of burial. His grave becomes known as the Holy Rabbi, Santo Rabbino. And you can look up articles that very periodically, there are articles I want. My favorite one was in the New York Times many years ago, Santo Rabbino, and they pray at his grave. And you come to the cemetery and all you see Hebrew inscriptions, the only Hebrew inscriptions in this huge cemetery, and it's piled with no stones. We have a tradition of putting stones. The Catholics light candles. It's almost impossible to see the actual stone of the grave. And Alicia and I have been there 2 or 3 times, and we always say a psalm and a kaddish with the group and with our family. Also, I should say that our son Harry was born in Brazil, so he is a Brazilian citizen as well as an American citizen. And he made his kids for the trip that we took together. He made them all Brazilian citizens, except for his wife. You know, any child of a Brazilian becomes an automatic citizen just by going to the passport office. A wife, because a spouse whom you can change, so you have to stay a year in the country. So the only one who doesn't have a Brazilian passport is Harry's 4 kids and Harry, and Dorit does not. So what happens to Moyal is that in the 50s, or maybe in the 60s, the family, the descendants of Solomon Moyal say he should be, now there's a Jewish cemetery, a small Jewish cemetery in Manaus. They want to move him. And the people say, you know, this is a sacred grave for us. This is very safe. You're moving something. To move him will make us very sad. And so they petitioned the rabbinate in Israel. Now that's not an easy rabbinate to deal with, but they ruled that. And here is the concept: Mipnei darchei shalom, because of the ways of maintain peace in the community and serenity, it was proper to leave Rabbi Moyal in. I'll take that later. Okay. So that grave remains, and I always thought that was a really understanding of the community. The family in Israel, living in Israel now, many generations later, wanted to move him, but the rabbinate agreed with the local Jewish community, and he remains there. The Santo Rabbino, the Catholic cemetery. It's one of my favorite stories.
Because now they have a Jewish cemetery. Okay, you take that call. All right. So some of the other places that we love. Well, I'm going to tell you one thing we should interject, because we didn't say it at the beginning, and we probably would have said it at the end, but it's certainly a point, is that if we don't count Alaska, Brazil is bigger than the United States. Okay. And so I think that's an interesting perspective. And because we talked about Manaus and then we talked about Recife, the flight from Manaus to Recife is about 2 hours by air. Okay. From Manaus, I'm going to talk about Ouro Preto. Ouro Preto doesn't have much Jewish history, but we love it. It is a World Heritage Site. It was a capital of Brazil in the 1500s. It is one of those preserved cities, very much like Williamsburg in Virginia, that it was deemed a historic site. So the exterior of the buildings cannot be changed. So when you come to the city, they've maintained the whole downtown area but it is the houses that are maintained as a historic site. And we had a beautiful experience there, so I loved it. First of all, there are 12 churches in Ouro Preto, which is this teeny tiny little town, which is very, very interesting. There was a church in Ouro Preto. Ouro Preto means black gold, and there was a great deal of gold in that area. And they had painted one of the churches with a gold roof. During the Second World War, they were, the world was afraid of the range of how far Rommel and Hitler would go. And so what they did is they painted over the gold. They painted the roof black because they wanted to protect it and make sure that that it was protected. Just as an interesting little side note, which has nothing to do with the places that we like, but since I brought it in, is that Rabbi Harry Nelson was sent by the American military to an American military base he was in Recife, right?
Yes.
He was in Recife, and we actually only learned about this not from him because he never talked about it, but when we arrived in Rio, someone had actually had a picture that was taken at some sort of gathering, with several other officers there, but it just sort of indicates that fear of not knowing how far the range was going to be of Hitler and Rommel, so that the United States set up a military base in Recife in case there was any military attack on that area. Anyway, so back to Ouro Preto. So we had taken, because of its historic beauty and interest, we had taken one of our groups there for Shabbat. It seemed like a perfect stopping place. One of the things, whenever the Nelsons have organized a Jewish history trip, and we've organized many, is that we don't travel on Shabbat. If you want to go on a tour, we will be glad to organize it, but we're not going to tour on Shabbat. So we had an opportunity to stop in Ouro Preto, and it was a nice community that you can easily walk around. And so we arranged for a Friday night dinner for the group, which was vegetarian, obviously, since there are no Jews in Ouro Preto to speak of. And we arrive at the dinner, and there on the table are two beautiful challahs. Now, we had brought little small challah rolls from Rio, thinking that we would not see any challah here. And we knew it would be a little stale, but at least we figured it would be challah for Shabbat. And so we were very moved. We were touched. We were surprised. We were very moved by the gesture. And we asked the manager, how did you know to make challahs for us? And he said, well, we have never had a Jewish group come here for the Sabbath. And so we looked it up on the internet. And so we made these challahs for you out of respect, which is really kind of very much the attitude about religion in Brazil. They love religion. And maybe we'll talk at the very, very end about a little attitude about religion, but that was a very interesting. And then we didn't even talk about Rio. Oh my gosh, we're talking too much.
No, that was a beautiful story. When we were there originally, we went one time to Recife and Bahia, but we didn't talk about Bahia. But yeah. I went into the restaurant where we would eat over Shabbat, and I said, I want to pay in advance. I said, it's a coisa religiosa, and a religious thing. And he says to me, wait a minute, if it's a religious thing, the owner of a very nice restaurant, said, if it's a religious thing, you can pay afterwards, can't you? You don't have to pay in advance. If I take your money in advance, I'm not showing faith in you. So I want you to come and enjoy, and then you pay afterwards. And I said, I once did that in the United States, and they said, you're trying to scam. I'm speaking better English than I do Portuguese. And when I finished my presentation, he said, you're scamming us. And so,
that was the experience
in New York.
Yeah, in New York. Yeah, you're trying to scam us. Yeah, because we wanted to pay ahead and come back.
I want to show faith in you.
Yeah, so that was a beautiful story. So I'm going to sort of zip through Bahia and not say a lot about Bahia, but Bahia was also a capital. Also very interesting. It's really like the New Orleans of Brazil. Why do I say like the New Orleans? Because it has very distinctive food, lots of history, lots of interesting culture. It's very African. There's a very large Black population. There's a lot of Macumba is the African religion that they brought with them when they came from Africa. And there's a lot of Macumba and all of the African presence, but it's a fascinating city, and it's a beautiful city, and it was a capital and a historic city. So,
And it's called, this is another test word. You can, maybe if Isaac Aboab de Fonseca is too hard to remember, it's hard for me. But about Bahia, Brazilians call it the soul of Brazil because of its music and its special qualities.
right.
Salvador Bahia Salvador is the main city. The cruise ships stop in Salvador when there are cruise ships. Alma do Brasil, they call it, the soul of Brazil. And it's very okay now.
Okay, so we'll hold on Rio because it's 10:30.
Oh,
Okay, any questions, comments? Okay,
are you still awake?
so they say, if either we're terribly boring because nobody has any questions or comments, or everybody knew this already. Anyway, all right, okay, so we have to, if there are no questions or comments, then we have to do a 1 minute stretch, right? So let's just put our hands up over our head, reach up, see if you can touch the ceiling. Touch the ceiling. Bring your hands together, lean to one side. Come up in the center, reach up to the ceiling, and then lean over to the other side. Okay. Okay. All right. So now we're going to talk about the people. We'll do that in idiosyncrasies. Okay. So people who, okay. Wait, one thing I have to say before you talk. No. I like it better when you do. Okay. That you have to remember, I was 25 years old and my husband was 28 years old. So you have to remember this when we talk about what a profound influence all of this had on us. Okay, you go, people.
People. Well, we got to Brazil, and there we met the synagogue leaders, the rabbi, and well, we didn't meet him. He sent a secretary to take us to our new apartment, and there was one couple, Jaco and Marivi Sequeira, and they were a phenomenal, the most interesting couple we ever met, and we got messed up in customs because it was a complicated story, but basically the x-rays that we were supposed to present as we came into the country were back in New York in the doctor's office. He forgot to give them, we didn't know that we were supposed to take them. And they said, where are your x-rays? We can't stamp your passport. So we were passportless for the first 6 weeks we were there. And Jaco Sequeira, from a family of Sephardic leaders in Lisbon, he said, well, you don't have your things out of that you were hoping you would be unpacked by now. You come to us for Shabbat, Friday night, and it's elaborate, beautiful Shabbat experience. And it would be very hard to describe it to you, but it was customs I had never seen. And for example, I don't know, should I go into the custom of you would have elaborate service, you're overlooking Avenida Atlantica, the city along the ocean, and someone you say you do the kiddush, and then you hesitate, and they serve you before you haven't done the motzi yet. You haven't washed your hands, because in the Sephardic, and certainly in Lisbon at least, and I've read about this custom after that, you're supposed to do 100 mitzvot a day. A mitzvah could be a ritual, so the saying of a prayer. Kiddush is a mitzvah to do the kiddush, and then they serve you 3 courses. So you say over them, you say Borei Minei Mizonot for. And then there's a vegetable course and a fruit course. You have 3 extra prayers because on Shabbat, the Shmona Esrei, the 19 benedictions are cut down to 7 in honor of Shabbat. You can't ask God to do certain things in that conception. And so they want you the Sephardim say, you have to get to 100 brachot a day. That's the goal. So we had 3 extra, but they're not just little things. They were elaborately served, and I'd never seen service like that. And then we sit down and we wash our hands, another blessing, and we do the motzi. We did that custom many times in our own home, but that was something I learned from Jaco. And Jaco took us around. We found an apartment that we liked, and so and he said after the first 3 weeks, we said we can't come here Friday night and Saturday as your guests. he said, did I offend you? And this was, this was where we learned Haknasat Orchim, hospitality. He said, if you don't come, it means that we did something to offend you the previous week. So for 6 weeks, we benefited from his beautiful hospitality. And many, many years later, when one of our dear friends was a famous jeweler, Jules and Zilda Sauer, you'll pick up on them, they lent us an apartment. When we came down there, they gave us this gorgeous overlooking the beach. And Jaco and Harry was there for the summer. And he said, I'm not, we have a suite here. You should come. And he said, no, I'm staying with Marie, my godmother at his bris. And Jaco, they were so close to us that they were our children's, Harry's godparents. And he stayed in the maid quarters, cramped, of an apartment just so he could be near this wonderful woman. Okay.
Okay.
So now.
So, all right, I will just pick up a moment before we talk about some of the other people who had profound influences on us. But Jacob and Marie remained very, very close to us. They were about 10 years older than us, and here we were, this young couple in foreign land with foreign customs and everything. And so we remained very, very close to them. They only had one daughter. Jacob died young, unfortunately. He was in his 50s when he died. But we remained in touch with Marie V and her daughter Teresa, and kept the contact. And Marie V and Teresa came to Harry's wedding in California. He was married 22 years ago. 22 years ago. But she came to that, but she didn't speak English at that point. But she came to his wedding. And we have remained in contact with Teresa, who we now call, whenever we're talking with her about her, we call her our Brazilian daughter, because Teresa was a year older than Harry, and she now has 2 children, and her son had a bar mitzvah about 2 years ago, and we decided that because this was now such a long-term friendship, that we should take our 3 grandchildren, all of whom were within bar mitzvah age, a year older, a year younger, and we should all go to Victor's bar mitzvah. So we did. We took the 3 of them. We had a great trip, and we went down for Victor's bar mitzvah. And when we were there, we met someone who said, he's now an adult, so we didn't recognize him, and he said, I am Ricardo, David and Augusta's son. So you talk about David and...
Well, David and Augusta Gorodovich, David came from Recife, and he invited me. He made his way to Rio, as many of the Jewish community either left there or went to Sao Paulo, of course, or Rio, and the bigger city, bigger Jewish community. And he recounted, David was a wonderful parent. You could see the way he regarded his Ricardo was his oldest, and he had 2 younger daughters who became very religious and now live in Israel. And David and Augusta are also in Israel now. And he would say to he would talk to his son. You'd hear, they would host us, and we'd hear him telling a nighttime story. He would excuse himself and tell a story to his son, a bedtime story, and then he'd come back and he'd almost apologize. He said, if you want your child to listen to you and to hear what you have to say when he's an adult, you have to talk to him as a child. And this was a ritual that he maintained. And so all of a sudden, 50 years later, this man stands in front of me at the bar mitzvah at a Sephardic temple, synagogue in Ipanema, and the names are all on the wall of very prominent citizens of Rio and Brazil and the world, actually. And he says, do you recognize me? I said, I really don't. He said, I'm Ricardo. And oh my God, it was very emotional for him and for me, even telling about it. And I mentioned his parents as when I did speak, I changed what I had to say. I added, and I talked about his parents and the influence that they had on me. And they asked me to speak, and I spoke for about 3 minutes, and I got applause, especially for my Portuguese, which was not flawless, believe me, but it was. These were people who meant a great deal to us. Okay. So that's the David story.
Okay, so the last family that we're going to talk about before we take another break and catch our breath, or give you a chance to catch your breath, so we don't barrage you with all kinds of stuff that means so much to us, and we hope will be interesting to you. But the last family that we're going to talk about is Samuel and Solika Ben-Oliel. And Samuel and Solika Ben-Oliel both had grown up in Brazil. They had 4 children, 3 daughters.
My grandfather was from Morocco, so they were Moroccan.
Okay, so yeah, so
Moroccan heritage.
Yeah, okay, so they started in Morocco. There. By the way, there is a big influx from Morocco into Brazil, and a number of the communities that they've kind of, been the immigrant population that grew the Jewish populations in the cities again from outside. No, just let it go. Yeah. Anyway, so, but Samuel and Solika, Samuel used to come, and, here we were, life in Brazil, while it's very different from life in America, there are certain similarities. And one is that the young families weren't there on Saturday morning, mostly because their kids were all on the beaches. So the question is, do you want to go to shul or do you want to go to the beach? I mean, that's a tough choice. Shul, beach, you got to decide. But Samuel was there every Saturday morning with his daughters. And so David, my husband, once said to him, Samuel, it's wonderful that you come with your girls. What brings you? Where did this get started? And what was it? And so Samuel told the following story to him. And he said, Rabbi, when I was a young man, my grandfather always took me to shul. And then I got older and I was a teenager. And I said to him, Grandpa, I don't want to come to shul all the time. It's boring. And so the grandpa says, well, why, when you come here, what do you think about? You say it's boring. What are you thinking about? He said, well, I'm thinking about girls. That's all I'm thinking about. That's all I can concentrate on. So the grandfather said, well, what % of the time do you think you're not concentrating on girls? So Samuel said, well, 5%. So his grandfather said to him, Samuel, come for that 5%. So he got in the habit of going to shul every Shabbos, and he passed that on to his girls. His youngest child was his son, Eduardo, and we left Brazil. We came back to the States. We were living in Detroit, and we kept in touch because, as we said near the beginning, we went back to Brazil every year or two. We would go back for a visit, and we got a letter from Samuel saying that they wanted to find an American family that would be willing to host their son, Eduardo. They wanted him to improve his English. Okay, so he'd be more fluent in English. So we said, well, we know a family that would be willing. So Eduardo came and lived with us for about 3 months.
Yeah.
And
when we were, now he's an adult, he owns 2 restaurants in Rio and 1 in Botafogo. And he invited us, the whole family, to come there. And he apologized to our daughter, Riva. And he said, our youngest, Riva, he said,
because we threw her
out of the room. We wouldn't put him in the basement for 3 months. We put her in the basement. And he said, oh, I realized later that I had dislodged you. And so it was a very funny story to us. But Riva nursed that along. She got her whole room redecorated when she came back to it. She didn't suffer.
She did okay.
That's the same child who wasn't enough to go to Rio and spend the summer in Rio, not the capital, but in that beautiful city, a Cidade Maravilhosa, they call it. Brazilians call it the marvelous city. But she wanted to go up the Amazon, which we did. And now I'm going off track. So you take us back to.
Okay. So it's about.
This is a chocolate-filled Hamantaschen. I don't like, what are they? What?
Poppy seed.
Oh, poppy seeds. Okay, but I don't, and so Alicia made chocolate
Deborah
filled, and Deborah made these.
Yes, okay, good. All right. Has anybody been to Rio? How many of you have been to Rio? Yes, good. So you saw it.
So
Good.
Dave Wolf has pictures. He sent them to Lisa Rappaport, and I can unmute Dave when you're ready. And
Ready.
Lisa's going to share some pictures. So that's an
Wonderful.
All right.
Wonderful.
So you tell us when. I just
Yeah.
wanted you to know what's
Okay.
No,
coming.
no,
I'll
that's a
tell you
perfect
one
time.
story because I listened very carefully last night to Paul and to Rick. Was a great program. And Paul said counting a minion in that picture so we used to count a real minion from the synagogue in Rio. And what could you see from wherever you stood? If you walked out of the synagogue, you could see a statue of Corcovado, statue of Jesus. Huge, oversees the whole city. You'll see in the photos. That'd be great, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's,
And so we did have a joke, the Brazilian, if we were short of a minion, we say, well, count him. And we got our minion when we had 9.
Corcovado.
That's
All right.
right. He was Jewish. So
Okay,
I want
that's
to
a
tell
perfect,
Paul that
yeah,
story.
that's a perfect place for pictures.
Okay, pictures.
Okay. So
Getting
I just
ready.
unmuted Lisa, and I'm going to unmute Dave. Thank you,
Okay.
Dick. Okay.
Lisa.
I'm getting it ready. I have
Okay.
2 screens. I have to make sure I'm showing the right one. Okay, here goes. Share screen. Can you see the picture or no?
Yes.
Yes. That's Oro Preto.
Yeah,
Yeah, these are all of Ouro Preto. They're,
Yeah.
I lived in Brazil in 1972, 73. I was an
Oh,
exchange
wow.
student there. And I lived in Belo Horizonte.
Okay.
I lived in a couple places in Minas Gerais. Minas Gerais is a large state, sort of in the central of the country. And the largest city and the capital is Belo Horizonte. A couple hours, maybe an hour and a half away is Ouro Preto. So I've been there a couple of times, and there's a few colonial towns very similar to Ouro Preto in the around Belo Horizonte. It's a very hilly town. You get your exercise going up and down the streets.
Mhm.
The last time I was there, which was in 2016, it was a workout going up and down the hills. So, and there's hundreds of churches. This is not a church. That you go, yeah, that is. I believe that was the town hall, but
Mhm.
there are. I don't know how many churches in the city, but there's everywhere you look. There's a
I think
church,
it's 12.
and they're not necessarily big,
Oh, is that
but
beautiful?
they are, they're all of sort of this style. And inside, as you mentioned before, there's gold everywhere. In fact, when I was there, when we were there several years ago, we went back in '97, I took my family down there. And actually, I have a picture somewhere of it. There's a tiny church in a little town, probably, again, about 45 minutes or so outside of Belo Horizonte. It's a really tiny church, and they call it the Little Church of Gold. When you walk into it, you are just struck by how much gold there is in this little tiny church. But it's a real, this Ouro Preto is an interesting town because it is, it's like walking, through history.
Mhm.
And I said I lived in 3 places in Minas Gerais. I lived nope, that's not it. I have pictures. I have hundreds of pictures of Brazil. I've been to Rio several times. The one town that I lived in was very close to the state of Bahia. I never actually got into, well, I got into the state of Bahia, but I never got up to Salvador or up to the Northeast. Or that's the part of Brazil I haven't been to. But I've done all the South. I've been as far south as the, Florida is Porto Alegre. And then down as far as that, I've been to the West, to Brasilia. So I know a fair amount. And I'll just add this, I did not, there were two instances where I ended up having Jewish experiences, if you will. In the first two towns that I lived in, there were no Jews. The first town was a little backwards town, as I said, very close to the border of Bahia. And then even in 1972, a lot of Brazilians thought this was like, they call it fim do mundo, the end of the world. It had 6 hours of electricity a day, no telephones. And this sounds weird, but it was a major thing in Brazil at the time. No asphalted highways, which meant it was pretty backwards. I lived there for about 3 or 4 months, and then I moved to a city called Uberlândia, which is a fairly modern, nice, progressive city. Today it's much larger, but anyway, and then I moved to Belo Horizonte. In any case, in Belo Horizonte, there were two instances where I ended up having Jewish experiences. One was, I don't know how my family or why my family did this. I wasn't overly religious, but around Passover, my host family said, "Hey, you want to go to a Seder?" And apparently they either knew a family or somehow they arranged for me to go to a Seder.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
And it was a unique experience because, never been to a Seder outside the United States. And I realized, sort of had that light bulb go off of all the similarities. There was a Haggadah, they were doing Hebrew, there was matzah on the table, there was gefilte fish, and there was Portuguese, which was the oddball of the whole thing. But it was, I realized that there was that kind of connection because of the Jewishness. And the second thing was, again, I don't know what motivated me to do this, but I found there was a synagogue. I don't know how many synagogues, if there was more than one in Belo Horizonte, but I found the synagogue and I decided to try to go to services. So on a Friday night, went to services and found out that it's essentially it's an Orthodox synagogue. But when I walked in, I was standing in the back and a man comes up to me and he says in Portuguese, he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Aqui, here." And he said, no. He said, "Você é brasileiro? Are you a Brazilian?" And I said, "No, Americano." And he said, "Oh," and he says in English, he said, "I'm from Buffalo." And the guy was, he was with the Peace Corps. And he invited me to Shabbat dinner at his house. It was, a few blocks from the synagogue. He walked in, he says, "Honey, I have a guest," because of course there were no cell phones in those days. And they split the fish 3 ways. And we had a very nice night. And I don't know how I sort of know how they kept kosher because, there were no kosher, there are no kosher butchers, there are no kosher restaurants, and there are no kosher anything in Belo Horizonte. In Rio, of course, there's a big population, but not in Belo Horizonte. So they made do with rice and fish, and they figured it out. And I went there a couple of times, and then I thought I was overstepping my welcome, and I didn't go back again. But again, it was that Jewish tie. It was pretty interesting, and I was 18 at the time, or 19 at the time, and it did make an impact on me. I realized, that as a people, there is something that unites us, just like any religion. That's my Jewish Brazilian story.
Wow.
Good.
That was
Excellent.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, now, I know that Carol said we're going to end a few minutes before 11, which it is now. So I will just end by saying that we hope you found it interesting. Paul, we loved what you shared. It was-
Is that not Paul?
Is that not Paul?
Are you Paul?
No, that's Dave.
Dave,
Dave.
I'm sorry, Dave. Sorry about
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
And anyway, so we loved what you shared. It's always fun to hear when someone else has had overlapping similar experiences. And we've enjoyed sharing it. So I hope that you have found it interesting. There's so much more as you can guess,
Dave said about.
but we
the
will
Seder-
leave it for
well,
another
But
presentation.
Dave talked about the Seder. That's the most memorable Seder we had were the ones in Rio. There were 5 languages
At our Seder
at our
table.
Seder table. And it was, we talk about that every time we
Yeah.
even ask the questions, though. We always recite one of the 4, one of the 4 questions in Portuguese. That's
Yeah. As a trip
influence.
down memory lane. Anyway, thank you for asking us. We hope you enjoyed.
Oh, will you take questions?
Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
yeah, you had said you wanted to end by 11, so
I don't always, I'm being recorded. I don't always tell the truth.
you're a
Yes.
liar?
No.
Yeah, really. I have to
Okay.
admit that when it comes to how we end. So I'm asking for forgiveness
Okay.
already. It's not
Okay.
fair for me not to offer questions. So
Okay.
what,
Can you feel
okay.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah.
Carol, I'm going to leave my husband to answer questions. Not that I'm not interested in what people have to ask, but I am Deborah's employer, our daughter Deborah. I'm her employer in the absence of existing programs. She comes every day to us at 10:30, and I told her that I would pick her up at 11. So I'm on to my next commitment, and I'm sure David can field.
I'll try.
Excellent.
I'll hold him for a few minutes.
All right.
And
Be my
then
guest. You could hold him all day.
No.
don't be surprised, Alicia, if
Yeah.
we invite you back. You were fabulous. And now I know why there's always so much excitement when Rabbi talks about Brazil. Thank you.
Okay, all right.
Okay, so-
We had, by the way, Dave, we had for 4 or 5 months a Peace Corps volunteer living with us. Jack would never leave. He loved Rio, and he didn't like his job up in the northeast of Brazil. Funny as it was beyond Recife. He was in a fishing village. He was a Columbia law student and graduate, and he wanted not to be drafted. And so he entered the Peace Corps. Yes.
Okay, so if anybody has a question, I see Sharon Sachs. Sharon, can you unmute?
Yeah, I don't know what you're saying. Come down here for a minute.
Hi.
So Sharon Sachs has a question
How did you know that?
because I
Okay.
saw your hand raised
All
on
right.
the screen.
Question. Yes.
Okay. So this is my question. I understand that you're talking about Passover and Seder and in various countries that there are numerous ways to make harosis. So I want to know which one is your favorite.
That's definitely an Alicia question. All Passover questions I consult. I'll send to you.
Okay. I'll
send
save it for the next time then.
Yeah, no, but we'll get you she has a great recipe for harosis, but you have to share yours though.
Well, I
And,
know that various countries do use different spices, and there's so many
we have a
different ways
Brazilian
apparently
cookbook.
to make
We'll
it.
look it up. We'll look it up. Okay. If I get it to Carol, will that be, or you send me your information? So other questions?
Debbie, can you unmute? Okay.
I did, okay. So my question is, was this the first place where you had your own congregation? Right out of Rabbi, rabbinical school?
Yes. Well, because in 1967, when I graduated, one day before the breakout of the Six-Day War, June 6th, we graduated June 5th. We graduated June 4th. June 5th was our Jewish world was falling apart. And Abraham Joshua Heschel on the faculty of the seminary was clearly opposed to the war in Vietnam. I was not. I mean, I was unhappy, but I was entering the rabbinical school required that we serve 2 years, and usually in the chaplaincy. So I was applying for a chaplaincy in the military, and they said, the leaders of the rabbinical assembly said, would you consider going to Rio de Janeiro or entering the chaplaincy? Now, my father had been a chaplain, so at a different time in history, and I had no objection to going in as a chaplain, and I was in the process of applying, and they said, would you go to Rio? They didn't finish the word Rio de Janeiro. Rio was enough. I signed up. So it was, if you remember, these were very troubled times, and we were 4D. Clergy students were 4D. If you remember Cassius Clay then, he was still Cassius Clay, tried to get a 4D designation. We as clergy students, as rabbinical students, automatically were 4D. And so that's how, so it was, I was not, I came, we served 2 years there. We almost stayed. And then I went back and I was an assistant rabbi and an associate rabbi at Chizuk Amuni in Baltimore for 3 years. And my first pulpit, solo pulpit, was in Oak Park, Michigan, where I stayed for my career until I renewed my contacts with Rodeph Sholom and a little place up in Western Michigan of 50 families. So I'm still involved in rabbinic work. I'm going this weekend for Purim, Thursday night. Tomorrow we leave for the western part of the state, and I'll lead services for Thursday night and Friday night. So that was is that clear? Yeah.
So Rabbi Nelson, will you come back and talk to us again?
Well, let me. I have to establish how many people fell asleep, how deep was the sleep, and anyone. So
I can tell you that
we have to revive the people, and then yes.
I didn't see anybody napping.
No, we love this.
I want to thank you. I know people have gauged their time for the hour, and we're all so busy, you know, in a pandemic where we can't go anyplace, but we're just tied up. So I think there's one more question.
Oh, sure.
And then we'll close for today. Sai, you have a, I don't even see Sai. Sai, are you here? I don't see him, Debbie.
Well, make up a question.
Sai.
Sai is there.
I
Sai,
don't
unmute and say hello. Sai, you're muted.
Hello, Lisa.
Okay.
Hi, Rabbi.
Sai, can you unmute?
Okay, now I
Okay.
think I'm unmuted, yeah.
Okay.
This is more of an historical question about Brazil. So somewhere along your talk, someone said that Brazil has a larger landmass than the United States, if you exclude Alaska.
That's a big exclusion.
Does Brazil have a central government like we have in Washington?
They have 26 states. There are 26 states, different states. And Dave referred to Minas Gerais, in which the capital was Belo Horizonte. And so Minas Gerais is one state of, we were in the state of Rio de Janeiro. There's a state of Sao Paulo. There's a state of Amazonas, but there's 26 states.
Wow.
So it's
so
the president.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, I'm just wondering about that. I know it's a large country. I just had no idea that there was.
Well, the Jewish community, by the way, is about 150,000. And an interesting story there was there were about 40,000 now. I think Rio is declining. A lot of people going to Israel, 40,000, but there are about 70,000 Jews living in Sao Paulo and about 10,000 in Porto Alegre. And so the population, when I was in Rio a long time ago, they wanted, so it was in 1968, and the American Jewish Committee came, the leaders of the American Jewish Committee came, and they wanted the Rio Jewish community, and Ari was the large synagogue. By the way, it was shaped like the tent of meeting. if you reckon, it was a beautiful, beautiful building. And it was a very active congregation. They asked the board of directors to give permission so they could count the Jews in, and these were all German Jews who were the founders of the Ari, and they spoke the language was of the pulpit was German until 1960, and the congregation was founded in 45 or 44. So they said, "Would you let us count you? We want to take a census." And they said, "Are you crazy? We just have, we were barely lucky to survive." And they had come by 1935, 36, 38. They were the last ones who came. And the Rabbi Lemley and his colleagues were given jobs in London by Lily Montague. And so that they were given these jobs to save them. There were about 10 rabbis who then went all over the world, Sydney, Australia also, but all the pulpits, Santiago and Montevideo and Buenos Aires, Rio and Sao Paulo, they were all German. And so they had, getting back to this original point I was making, they said, "Are you crazy?" to the American Jewish Committee. I was at that meeting. They're very polite. Everybody uses a lot of beautiful language. Portuguese is a beautiful language, and we had a translator. And they said, "No, you're not counting us. Don't you think that if a Nazi-like government would come to power, they wouldn't find you?" And they said, "No, you're not counting us. We will not make it easier. There will be no lists of the Jewish community." I thought that was to me, that was a powerful meeting that I attended. And so we don't know how many there are, but your question was,
I'm just curious if they had a central government in Brazil, or it was just sort of established as autonomous regions.
No, in the period that we were there, the military took over the government, and but it was the military. Now they have an awful president, but we hope that someone better will be elected. I mean, in my opinion.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think if you have questions, I didn't see any other raised hands. Sharon Bird.
Oh, I'll tell you a brilliant Brazilian expression that I love. And Sharon, who is that? Who did you call just now?
Hi, David.
Oh my God, I forget what I want to see. Yes, hello.
Well, my question is, does the Brazilian government offer citizenship to Sephardi Jews as Portugal and Spain do?
That's a wonderful question. I wish I had the, I don't know. That's a wonderful question. Probably not, but.
And why would anybody want it? But
yeah, that's a very interesting question. So nice to see you. Where you're living in?
Sarasota, Florida.
Sarasota, Florida. I was going to say Florida.
So I have another question, Rabbi. Erica Cohn has a question for you. Erica?
Yes, Erica, yes.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rabbi. Wonderful program. Have you visited San Diego, Chile, when you were living in Brazil?
No, not when I was living there, but about 5 years ago, we flew to Santiago and then went all the way down the coast, almost to Punta Arenas and the national park in the very southern tip. But we didn't get to Antarctica, but we were in Santiago. Why? Are you?
Yeah, I have a first cousin living there, and he's the kosher meat butcher, and he runs a small business. Used to come stay with us and order food van at New York.
How large was the Jewish community in Santiago?
I mean, these were also survivors. His family, his in-laws, they were Holocaust survivors. I don't know the answer to that. Thank you.
Well, but the congregation the congregation that I served was the first generation were all German Jews.
These were from Czechoslovakia.
And
them.
the interesting thing, there's so much interesting thing. The rabbis were from the liberal movement in Germany, which meant that the synagogues were very unique. They had an organ at every service, played. Now they have gotten a little more traditional, so they've moved away from the organ, I think, or it's not functioning anymore. But men and women until the year 2000 sat on no mechitza, but they sat on separate sides. That was the liberal, and it was very close very close to the reform movement, the liberal movement in Germany. So they had men and women separated, and they could sit together in the balcony, but nobody sat there. And now it's men and women, but it took them a long time because they asked experts around the world, and they said, well, you have a unique custom there. Why don't you just maintain it? And then eventually the younger generation had their way, but it was a long time in coming. So,
my cousin became very religious, and he's, I think, in Lubavitcher. He's Shomer Shabbos, he's the kosher business, whatever, very minimal.
Did you see that cartoon with the landing on Mars, and they get out and there's a Chabad house?
He became, his parents weren't that religious.
Amazing outreach.
Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. I have another request for a question. Is there anybody else? Because I'm going to go back to Dave in 1 second. Any other questions? Okay, Dave. Okay.
Just to piggyback on what the rabbi said in response to Sa about the government. When the rabbi was there, it was, I guess you just came after the coup, the military coup. And up in 1988, they created a new constitution, which made it technically a democracy, but it still had military control. And so when I was there, there was it was sort of the end of the there was still censorship, and there was some political unrest, but I didn't see a lot of it. But you could tell that was still under military control to a certain degree. More recently, if you ask Brazilians, they'll say they are a democracy. They live in a democracy. Over the past few years, it became there is a middle class, or over the years, a middle class has grown, and they started being vocal. And a few years ago, there was the Workers' Party that came up. Lula came up as the president, and he was from the Workers' Party. Make long story short, Brazil is a political mess. They had in 2016, they impeached their president. In fact, I was at dinner with a bunch of Brazilians.
It seemed very unfair, an unfair kind of dislodging of the president. Well,
it was also due to the car wash scandal. It was a whole big, like 80% of their Congress was indicted as part of a scandal. So, but anyway, I was there when Dilma was impeached. But the Brazilians were more concerned. This was September of 2016. And I asked at the dinner table, I said, hey, Dilma's being impeached today. What do you think? How is that going to affect the country? And they said, don't worry about that. But is Trump going to become president in the United States? That was what their main concern was. And coincidentally, as again, you alluded to, Rabbi, their current president is Bolsonaro. And he's very similar to Trump.
He wants the military. He wants the military to return.
Yes, he wants the military to return, and he was very much like Trump. And so there's still a lot of political turmoil down there. But the Brazilians, as Brazilians, they're a very optimistic people, and they always, it's always amanhã, tomorrow. The politics aside, the world's going to be great. Everything's going to be fine. You know, if you ask them, they say, don't worry about it. They just have a very
Yes.
free spirit, very positive spirit. So I wish them well. They have they're a giant down in South America, but you know they have a lot of issues. But it's a great country. The people are wonderful. So.
Okay, so thank you, Dave, for
Yes.
adding to the
Yeah,
program.
that was great.
I need to go back to something I said earlier when Alicia was here about time, and I said I lie. I do lie about time. You all know Mike, and he said I never knew how to tell time. So I did call this program for an hour, and I always know that if we have to go over, we can, that people will jump off if they have to. But I want you to know this is the only time that I am untruthful with what time we end. So I'm going to once again thank Rabbi Nelson and Alicia, and thank you all for coming.
It was great.
I hope you enjoyed it. I believe you did. Please let me know if you haven't already responded about the Passover and Shabbat Across America bags. Remember that tonight we have a meeting to approve our bylaws. Tomorrow night and Friday are Purim, and Rabbi Eisenberg said, if you don't have a grogger, just bring a pot, he said, and a spoon, and you can get rid of that nasty man's name. And Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock, we've got Brett Bowles. And as I said last night, a fabulous program is about to begin. So thank you all for coming. Rabbi Nelson, thank you,
Oh,
thank
it's a
you.
pleasure. Thank you for asking. Shalom, shalom.